The dust of the high plains was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated the tongue, stung the eyes, and settled like a shroud on the silent, waiting crowd. It clung to the raw pine of the gallows, a grim monument clawing at the bleached blue sky. On the platform stood Jedediah, his world shrunk to the splintery wood beneath his bare feet, and the coarse hemp biting into the skin of his neck. The rope was a promise, a final suffocating truth. Below him, the faces of Redemption Gulch were a blur of sun-hardened leather and righteous scorn, a sea of judgment that had already drowned him. He saw Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of dust and political ambition, his hand resting near the lever, his gaze fixed on something over Jedediah's shoulder, the sprawling ranch of Silas Croft, the man who owned the town, the cattle, the law, and now Jedediah's last breath. Croft stood near the front, a thick, bull-necked man whose prosperity was a shadow that starved lesser men. He had a smile on his face, a tight, satisfied curl of the lips that said, "This is how worlds are ordered. This is how men like me stay on top." Jedediah had been his scout, the best he'd ever had, until he'd discovered Croft was rebranding government cattle, stealing from the very herds he was paid to protect. He had confronted him, and for that he was here. A dead sheepherder. A knife with Jedediah's mark conveniently found in his back, and a swift, merciless trial were all it took. The circuit judge, a man with whiskey on his breath and Croft's gold in his pocket, had called him a blight, a cancer to be cut out. And the town, hungry for a villain to blame for their own hard-bitten lives, had readily agreed. The preacher was droning on, his words about sin and salvation lost to the wind and the pounding in Jedediah's ears. He wasn't listening. He was trying to remember his mother's face, the smell of pine in the high mountains of his youth, the taste of clean water. But all he could conjure was the grit in his teeth and the suffocating weight of the lie that was choking him long before the rope would. He saw the children, their eyes wide with a terrible, morbid curiosity. He saw the women, some whispering behind their hands, others with a grim satisfaction, as if his death would somehow make their own meager larders fuller, their own lonely beds warmer. His gaze swept over them one last time, a final silent accusation, and then he saw her. She stood near the back, slightly apart from the others, as if the crowd itself were a disease she feared catching. Ilara, he knew her name, though they had never spoken. She was the town's other ghost, a widow whose husband and infant daughter had been taken by the winter fever less than a year ago. The town treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if her grief were a contagion. She was pale, thin, her black dress hanging on a frame that seemed too fragile for the harshness of this land. Her eyes, wide and haunted, were not filled with the same righteous fury as the others. They were filled with a hollow, echoing emptiness he recognized, for he felt it in his own soul. In her hand, she clutched a small, worn object of wood, rubbing it with her thumb in a steady, desperate rhythm. He knew what it was. A child's toy. A small, carved bird her husband had made. He had seen him working on it outside their small cabin on the edge of town. The sight of it, of her, of that small, defiant act of memory in the face of so much forgetting, was a crack in his own resolve. A single hot tear escaped his eye, tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. The preacher finally fell. Silent, the sheriff cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. The crowd leaned forward, a collective intake of breath. This was the moment, the release. The final punctuation to the town's judgment. Sheriff Miller placed his hand firmly on the wooden lever. Croft's smile widened. Jedediah closed his eyes, bracing for the sickening drop, the snap, the darkness. He sent a final, desperate prayer, not to God, for he felt God had long since abandoned this place, but to the memory of the mountains, to the clean, cold air of freedom. "Stop!" The voice was a blade, sharp and clear and utterly unexpected. It sliced through the thick, expectant silence, turning every head. Jedediah's eyes flew open. Sheriff Miller's hand froze on the lever. Alara, the widow, had taken a step forward. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the little wooden bird. Her face was a mask of terror, but her voice, when it came again, did not waver. It rang with the impossible, shattering force of a church bell at a graveyard. "You cannot hang him," she cried, her voice trembling but carrying across the dusty plaza. "The law forbids it." Sheriff Miller squinted, his face a canvas of confusion and irritation. "What nonsense is this, woman? Get back. This ain't your concern." "It is my concern," she insisted, taking another step, her haunted eyes locked on the sheriff, refusing to look at Jedediah, as if he were the sun and she would be blinded. "You cannot hang this man." Silas Croft stepped forward, his shadow falling over the sheriff. "Miller, what is the meaning of this delay? Get on with it. The town wants justice." "Why?" the sheriff demanded, his voice a low growl aimed at Alara. "Give me one good reason, or I'll have you thrown in a cell for interfering." The crowd murmured, a low, angry hum. They had been promised a death. They did not like being denied their entertainment. Ilara's chest rose and fell in a ragged, panicked rhythm. The world seemed to tilt, the faces around her warping into grotesque masks of impatience and cruelty. She felt the weight of every eye, the sting of their collective scorn. She was a widow, a barren woman, a ghost. What was she doing? This was madness. But the image of the single tear on the condemned man's face had pierced through her fog of grief. It was a reflection of her own endless, silent weeping. It was a spark of life in a place dedicated to death. And in that moment, something inside her, something she thought had died with her daughter, rebelled. She lifted her chin, and the lie born of desperation and a sudden, wild empathy fell from her lips, fully formed and irrevocable. "Because he is my husband." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the heat, deeper than the grave that had already been dug for Jedediah at the edge of town. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust, a phantom dancing between the stunned faces. Husband. The word hung in the air, an impossible, audacious claim. Jedediah stared at her, his mind reeling. He had never spoken to this woman. He knew her only by the tragedy that defined her. And now she had bound herself to him with a lie more damning than the one that had put him on this platform. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else, a core of unyielding steel he had not expected. Silas Croft let out a short, barking laugh. Her husband? The woman's gone mad with grief. She doesn't know what she's saying. Miller, end this farce. But the sheriff hesitated. He was a weak man, but he was a man of procedure. There were old, dusty laws, rarely invoked, about the testimony of a spouse, about family claims. A public declaration like this, in front of the entire town as witnesses, could not simply be ignored, no matter how absurd. It would create complications, paperwork, questions. It muddied the clean, simple narrative of justice served. "Is this true, prisoner?" the sheriff asked, turning his gaze to Jedediah. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. Here was a door, a crack of light in the suffocating darkness, a lie for a lie, an absurdity to fight an absurdity. He looked from the sheriff's uncertain face to Croft's gathering rage, and then back to Alara. She was trembling, her face ashen, but she held his gaze. In her eyes he saw not a savior, but a fellow drowning soul offering a hand. He didn't know what her gain was, what madness had possessed her, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that it was his only chance. He swallowed, the motion painful. Against the rope. "Yes," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse and fear. "She is my wife." The word felt alien on his tongue, a piece of a life he had never lived. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was no longer a simple hanging, it was a drama. A scandal. The sheriff cursed under his breath, trapped between Croft's fury and the unyielding letter of a law he barely understood. He looked at Croft, a silent, pleading question in his eyes. Croft's face was purple with rage. He saw his perfect, clean resolution slipping away, tangled in the ravings of a grieving widow. He gave the sheriff a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He would handle this later, in the shadows. For now, the public stage was compromised. The sheriff sighed, a long gust of frustration. "Cut him down," he ordered, his voice laced with venom. "But he's your responsibility, woman. He's to be confined to your property until the circuit judge returns in the spring. One step out of line, 1 foot off your land, and I'll hang him myself and you right alongside him for perjury. Do you understand?" Ilara could only nod, her body swaying with a relief so profound it was dizzying. 2 of the sheriff's deputies, their faces sullen, climbed the steps. One held a knife and sawed through the thick hemp rope. The fibers parted with a rasping sound, and Jedediah stumbled forward, his knees buckling, the sudden freedom from the rope's bite making him gasp. He fell to the wooden platform, coughing, his hands instinctively going to his raw, bruised neck. He was alive. He was alive, and he owed his life to the lie of a woman he did not know. The deputies dragged him to his feet and shoved him down the steps. They marched him through the silent, parting crowd, a path of whispers and hostile stares opening before them. They stopped in front of Ilara. She stood frozen, the wooden bird still clutched in her hand, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. "He's all yours, widow," the deputy sneered, shoving Jedediah toward her. He stumbled, catching his balance just before he would have fallen at her feet. And so they stood, the condemned man and the grieving widow, too. Strangers bound by an impossible lie, the dust of Redemption Gulch swirling around their feet as the town watched, waiting for their next move. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She turned and began to walk, her steps stiff and automatic, toward the edge of town, toward the small, lonely cabin that was both her sanctuary and her prison. After a moment's hesitation, Jedediah followed, his bare feet kicking up puffs of red dust. He was a ghost trailing a ghost, walking away from his own grave and into a future more uncertain than the one that had awaited him at the end of a rope. The walk to her cabin was a silent eternity. The sun beat down, and the whispers of the townspeople felt like physical blows against Ilara's back. She could feel his presence behind her, a heavy, looming shadow. He was taller than she'd realized. His frame lean but powerful, even now, stooped with exhaustion and shock. She didn't dare look back. What had she done? What madness had seized her? She had invited a stranger, a man the town called a murderer, into her home, her sanctuary. The home she had shared with Thomas and little Lily. The thought of him stepping across that threshold was a violation so profound it made her stomach churn. But the thought of his body, swinging in the afternoon sun, had been worse. She had seen enough death. She would not stand by and watch another soul be extinguished by the casual cruelty of this town. Her cabin was small, just 1 room, built of rough-hewn cottonwood that had grayed with the seasons. A stone chimney stood at one end, and a single window looked out over the vast, unforgiving expanse of the plains. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was the last piece of her old life. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she lifted the latch. For a moment she hesitated. This was the final, irreversible step. Once he was inside, the lie would become real. It would have walls, a roof, a floor. She took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the cool dimness. Within, she did not turn to invite him in. She simply left the door open and walked to the small table in the center of the room, her legs threatening to give out. She sank onto a stool, placing the small wooden bird on the tabletop with a quiet click. The sound was deafening in the silence. Jedediah paused at the threshold. He smelled wood smoke, dried lavender, and the faint, lingering scent of sorrow. The cabin was immaculately clean, but achingly empty. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, a patchwork quilt folded neatly upon it. A small stone hearth was swept clean. On a shelf above, it sat a man's shaving mug and a woman's silver-backed brush side by side, like silent mourners. This was a shrine to a life that was over. And he was an intruder, a desecration. He stepped inside, his bare feet silent on the smooth, worn floorboards. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud, plunging the room into a deeper gloom, and sealing them inside. He stood by the door, his back pressed against it, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. He watched her, her back ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate skin of her neck, the same neck the rope had just been meant to break on him. He cleared his throat, the sound raw and painful. "Why?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was the only word that mattered. Ilara didn't turn. She stared at the wooden bird, its smooth, familiar shape a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unfamiliar. "I don't know," she answered, her voice barely audible, and it was the truth. It had been an impulse, a rebellion, a scream against the void. I saw the way they looked at you. It was the same way they looked at me when the fever came, like I was a blight, something to be cut out." She finally turned her head, her eyes shadowed with grief meeting his. No one deserves to die alone, surrounded by hate. Jedediah absorbed her words, a balm on the raw wound of his soul. She hadn't saved him because she believed him innocent. She had saved him because she understood his humiliation. It was an act not of faith, but of empathy. And that was somehow more profound. He looked around the small cabin again, one bed, one room. The reality of their situation settled in, heavy and awkward. The sheriff said, "I'm your responsibility, confined here." He gestured vaguely at the small space. "Where?" "The floor," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She stood up, moving to the hearth. "There are blankets in that chest. The floor is yours." There was no welcome in her voice, no comfort. She had saved his life, but she was not offering him sanctuary. This was a prison for them both. He was her prisoner, and she was a prisoner of the lie she had told. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms. He was a guest in his own jail. He walked to the wooden chest by the hearth and lifted the lid. Inside were 2 thick wool blankets and a small flat pillow. They smelled of cedar and disuse. He took them out and laid them on the floor in the corner farthest from her bed, creating a space that was his, a small island in this sea of her grief. The first few days were a torment of silence. They moved around each other like wary animals, their orbits carefully calibrated to avoid contact. The small cabin seemed to shrink with the weight of their unspoken thoughts. Jedediah's body ached. The rope burns on his neck were raw and beginning to fester. He slept fitfully on the hard floor, the ghosts of the gallows visiting him in his dreams. He would wake with a gasp, the phantom sensation of the drop stealing his breath, his hands flying to his throat. Ilara would pretend to be asleep, her body rigid in her bed, her heart pounding in sympathy and fear. Who was this man? What violence was he capable of? During the day, she worked. She tended her small vegetable garden with a fierce, single-minded determination. She scrubbed the floor, mended her clothes, cooked her meager meals. She did everything with a quiet, desperate intensity, as if constant motion could keep the memories at bay. Jedediah watched, a helpless observer. He was a man of action, a scout used to the open sky and the constant demands of the trail. Confined within these four walls, he felt his strength atrophy. He felt useless. The silence between them was sharp, loaded with questions they were both too afraid to ask. On the third day, he could bear it no longer. She was outside weeding. Her garden, her back to the cabin. He saw the way she winced as she bent over, the strain on her face. He walked to the water bucket. It was nearly empty. Without a word, he picked it up and walked out the door, heading for the well near the edge of her property. He felt the sun on his face, the breeze in his hair, and the simple act of walking on the earth felt like a miracle. He worked the pump, the rusty handle squeaking in protest, and filled the bucket to the brim. The water was cool and clear. He carried it back, his muscles protesting the unaccustomed weight. He set it down just inside the door and retreated to his corner. Ilara came back inside a few minutes later, wiping sweat from her brow. She saw the full bucket of water. She looked at it, then at him, his face turned away, staring at the wall. She said nothing. But that evening, when she served their silent meal of corn mush and boiled potatoes, she placed a small bowl of salted water and a clean rag next to his plate. Her meaning was clear. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward his neck. After they ate, he sat on the floor in his corner and carefully, painfully, cleaned the raw, weeping burns around his throat. The salt stung, but it was a clean pain, a healing pain. It was the first act of tenderness, however clumsy and unspoken, that had passed between them. The next morning, he woke to the sound of rain, a steady drumming on the roof. A chill had settled in the cabin. He saw that Ilara was shivering in her sleep, the thin quilt pulled up to her chin. The fire in the hearth was little more than glowing embers. He got up quietly, added a few small logs from the woodpile by the door, and gently blew on the embers until a small flame flickered to life. He sat by the growing fire, soaking in its warmth, until the sky began to lighten. When Ilara awoke, the cabin was warm and a small pot of water was already heating by the fire. She looked at him, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was tempered with something else, a reluctant acknowledgement. They were no longer just a prisoner and a jailer. They were two people in a room, trying to survive. The rain continued. For 2 days, trapping them in the cabin's suffocating intimacy. The roof began to leak, a steady drip, drip, drip near the window. Ilara placed a pot on the floor to catch the water, her face tight with frustration. "It's been doing that since the last big storm," she said, the first unsolicited words she had spoken to him. "Thomas, my husband, he was always going to fix it." Jedediah stood up and looked at the dark, spreading stain on the ceiling. "There are probably some shingles loose," he said. "When the rain stops, I can look at it." She just nodded, turning away. But the offer hung in the air between them, another small brick in the fragile bridge they were building. When the sun finally broke through, Jedediah went outside. He found a rickety ladder behind the cabin and climbed onto the roof. As he worked, replacing the loose shingles with ones he found in a small pile nearby, he felt a sense of purpose. Return. This was something he understood. Mending what was broken. From his vantage point, he could see the town, a collection of small, grim buildings huddled together in the distance. He saw figures moving in the street, and he knew they were being watched. He and the widow. The town's strange, scandalous new family. He felt a surge of defiance. Let them watch. Down below, Ilara came out of the cabin. She didn't look up at him, but she began to work in her garden, weeding and watering, a silent companion in his labor. They worked all afternoon under the tufan. Warm sun, not speaking, but aware of each other's presence, a shared rhythm of toil connecting them. That night, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was less heavy, less fraught with fear. It was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who have worked together. The news of their cohabitation spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. The story grew more lurid with each telling. The grieving widow had taken a lover, a murderer. She was shameless, possessed. Silas Croft fanned the flames, his words dripping with sanctimonious poison. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the purity of womanhood, all while ensuring his cronies whispered the ugliest rumors in the saloon and the general store. Ilara felt the town's judgment like a physical weight. When she went to the general store for flour and salt, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, served her with a grim face, refusing to meet her eye. The other women in the store turned their backs on her, their whispers like the hissing of snakes. Bought herself a man right off. The gallows, one said, just loud enough for her to hear. What kind of woman does that? Another added. A desperate one. She fled the store, her face burning with shame and anger, clutching her meager supplies. She ran all the way back to the cabin, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She burst through the door and threw the flour sack on the table, where it landed, with a soft thud, sending up a puff of white. Jedediah, who had been carving a piece of scrap wood with his knife, a habit from his scouting days, looked up, his face alarmed. He saw her tears, the raw pain in her eyes. He stood up, taking a half-step toward her, his hands open in a gesture of helpless concern. What is it? What happened? They hate me, she choked out, sinking onto the stool. They all hate. And me. They think we. She couldn't finish the sentence. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. He stood there, a statue of impotent fury. He was the cause of this. His presence had brought this fresh hell down upon her. He was a poison in her life, a blight, just as the judge had. Sighed. He should leave. He should walk out the door, take his chances on the plains. It would be better for her. But the sheriff's threat echoed in his mind. I'll hang him myself and you right alongside him. He couldn't leave. He was tethered to her, and she to him. Let them talk, he said, his voice a low growl. Their words are wind. They are small people, afraid of anything they don't understand. It's easy for you to say, she shot back, her head snapping up, her eyes flashing with anger. You don't have to face them. You don't have to see the way they look at me. No, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. I just have to remember the way they looked at me when they were waiting for me to die. His words struck her, silencing her anger. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the condemned man, past the stranger in her house. She saw the raw wound of his own humiliation, a wound that mirrored her own. They were two sides of the same coin, minted in the currency of the town's scorn. She took a deep breath, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean. I know, he said. And he did. From that day on, a subtle shift occurred. It was no longer just her against the town. It was them. When she needed supplies, he insisted on going with her. The sheriff had confined him to her property, but the well was on the edge of it, and the path to town started just beyond. It was a risk, a deliberate provocation. Their first walk into town together was an ordeal. They walked side by side. Not touching, but their proximity was a statement. The whispers followed them like flies. The stares were like daggers. But this time, Ilara did not flinch. She held her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Jedediah walked beside her, his presence a silent shield. He was a dangerous man, they thought. Let them think it. Let them be afraid. In the store, Mr. Henderson's eyes widened when Jedediah followed her in. He stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask, while Ilara made her purchases. The other customers gave them a wide berth. No one whispered. They paid and left, walking back through the gauntlet of silent, hostile stares. They didn't speak on the way back to the cabin, but they didn't need to. They had faced the town. together and had not broken. They had forged their lie into a shield, but not everyone in Redemption Gulch was an enemy. One evening, they found a small bundle on their doorstep. Inside were medicinal herbs, yarrow for fever, comfrey for wounds, and a freshly baked loaf of bread, still warm. There was no note, but Alara knew who it was from. Old Willow, a native woman who lived alone in the hills, another soul cast out by the town's fear and prejudice. Elura's husband, Thomas, had been one of the few who had treated her with kindness, trading her vegetables for her remedies. It was a small gesture, but it was a crack of light in the darkness. A few days later, the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, whose children had played with Lily, stopped by. He pretended he was there to check on a loose hinge on the cabin door. A hinge he had fixed himself a year ago. He was gruff and didn't stay long, but as he left, he looked at Jedediah. "My wife's got a brother," he said, not meeting his eye. "Scout for the army. Says he knew a man named Jedediah. Said he was the most honest man he ever rode with." He tipped his hat at Alara and walked away, leaving his words hanging in the air. Jedediah stared after him, his heart aching with a gratitude so fierce it was painful. It was the first time since his arrest that someone had spoken of his honor. He looked at Alara, and she was smiling, a true small smile that reached her eyes. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the shadows. He felt his own lips curve in response. In the shared warmth of that small moment, the cabin felt less like a prison and more like a home. The seasons began to turn. The brutal heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden days of autumn. The routine of their life together became a source of comfort. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. He showed her how to reinforce the small corral where she kept her 2 chickens, making it safe from coyotes. In return, she taught him the quiet rhythms of the land. She showed him which roots were edible, which berries were sweet. She taught him the names of the constellations her father had taught her, stories of heroes and gods written in the vast, dark sky. They talked, not about their pasts, not about the gaping wounds in their souls, but about small things. The way the light hit the plains at dawn. The taste of the wild plums they gathered. They were carefully, cautiously, building a life in the ruins of their old ones. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he was carving again. He had become adept at it, his hands finding a new purpose. She watched the small figure take shape under his knife. It was a bird, its wings outstretched, ready for flight. It was almost identical to the one her Thomas had made for Lily. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was finished, he sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone until it felt like silk in his hand. He held it out to her. She looked from the new bird to the old one, which sat on the mantelpiece, a constant, painful reminder. Her eyes filled with tears. I can't," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't pull his hand back. "It's not a replacement," he said softly, his voice gentle. "It's a companion, so the other one isn't so lonely." Her resolve broke. A sob escaped her lips. She took the bird from his hand, its smooth, warm wood a comfort against her palm, and then she began to talk. She told him about Thomas, about his kindness, his laughter. She told him about Lily, about the color of her eyes, the sound of her giggle, the devastating speed with which the fever had taken her. She wept for her lost family, for the hollowness in her heart. Jedediah listened. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. He simply sat with her in her grief, his presence a steady, silent anchor in the storm of her sorrow. He bore witness to her pain, and in doing so, he lessened its weight. When her tears finally subsided, a fragile peace settled over the room. She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his own heart aching with a mix of sorrow for her loss and a strange, new feeling he couldn't name. It felt like a homecoming. Later that night, As she lay in her bed, she watched him sleeping on the floor, his face softened in the moonlight. The fear she once felt was gone, replaced by a fierce protective tenderness. This man, this stranger, understood her in a way no one else could. He had seen the ugliest parts of her grief and had not turned away. The lie she had told on the gallows had been a moment of madness. But now, in the quiet darkness of the cabin, it felt like the most profound truth she had ever known. She had saved his life, but he, in turn, was saving hers. The first snow of winter came early, a thick white blanket that muffled the world. In silence, the plains disappeared, transformed into a vast empty sea of white. The cabin became their entire world, a small arc of warmth and light against the encroaching cold. They had laid in their supplies potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, salted meat, flour, and beans. Jedediah had chopped a mountain of firewood, stacking it high against the cabin wall. They were prepared. They were survivors. But Silas Croft was not a man to be deterred by a little snow. His rustling operation was suffering without a skilled scout to find the best roots, and the whispers about Jedediah's innocence, fanned by Gus the blacksmith, were growing louder. Croft was a man who understood that power, once challenged, must be reasserted with overwhelming force. He saw Jedediah not just as a threat to his freedom, but as a symbol of defiance. And the widow who protected him was an insult to his authority. He would erase them both. He would burn out the infection before it could spread. The blizzard hit on the third night, a howling monster of wind and snow. It screamed around the corners of the cabin, rattling the window and shaking the door in its frame. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a defiant heart against the storm's fury. Elara was mending one of Jedediah's shirts. He was sitting at the table, sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar, comforting sound. Suddenly, the chickens in the corral began to squawk, a panicked, terrified sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind. Jedediah was on his feet in a second, his knife in his hand, his body tensed. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. He crept to the door, pressing his ear against it. The wind howled, but beneath it, he heard another sound. The crunch of boots in the snow, more than one man. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. She blew out the lamp, plunging the room into the flickering firelight. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white. A heavy fist pounded on the door. "Sheriff Miller, open up!" Jedediah exchanged a look with Elara. It wasn't the sheriff's voice. It was one of Croft's ranch hands. He knew it was a lie. The sheriff wouldn't come out in a storm like this. This was something else. This was the end of the game. "We know you're in there, Jedediah," another voice yelled. "Croft wants a word with you." The pounding grew more insistent, then splintered as a heavy boot kicked the door. The wood groaned, the latch straining. Jedediah moved quickly, shoving the heavy table against the door to brace it. "Elara, the back window," he hissed. "Go. Run for the hills, hide." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood by the hearth, the poker held like a weapon. "This is my home. I'm not leaving you." His heart swelled with a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. In this moment of terror, she had chosen him. She had chosen them. The door shuttered again, the wood cracking. A heavy log, used as a battering ram, smashed against it. The top hinge tore loose. "There's an old rifle," she said, her voice a strained whisper, "under the bed. Thomas's. I don't know if it even fires." He didn't hesitate. He dove for the bed, his hand searching in the darkness beneath it. His fingers closed around the cold steel of a rifle barrel. He pulled it out. It was an old Spencer, heavy and solid. He checked the chamber by feel. It was loaded. He didn't know if he had more than one shot, but one might be all he got. The door burst inward with a crash, the table scraping back across the floor. Two figures, their faces covered with scarves against the cold, stumbled into the room, silhouetted against the swirling snow outside. They were followed by two more. One of them was Silas Croft. He held a lantern high, its light casting long, dancing shadows. "Well, well," Croft sneered, his eyes glittering with malice. "A cozy little love nest." "I'm sorry to interrupt. What do you want, Croft?" Jedediah said, his voice steady as he cocked the rifle. The sound was a loud, definitive click in the small room. Croft's eyes narrowed at the sight of the gun. "I want what's mine. I want to clean up a mess. You should have hanged Scout. This is just tying up a loose end." He nodded to his men. "Burn it." One of the men held a torch, its flames licking hungrily in the wind. He took a step toward the curtains. Jedediah raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel. "Take one more step, and you're a dead man." The man hesitated, looking at Croft. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You won't shoot, Jedediah. You're not a killer. That's the lie they told about you, remember?" But as he spoke, Ilara moved. With a cry that was part rage, part terror, she lunged from the shadows, swinging the heavy iron poker. She caught the man with the torch across the arm. He yelled in pain, dropping the torch into a pile of firewood by the hearth. The dry wood caught instantly, flames erupting with a whoosh, racing up the wall. The cabin was filled with smoke and the roar of the fire. In the chaos, one of Croft's other men drew a pistol. Jedediah didn't think. He fired. The rifle's blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The man screamed and clutched his shoulder, staggering back out into the snow. Croft, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, drew his own gun. He aimed at Jedediah. But before he could fire, a dark shape filled the broken doorway. It was Gus, the blacksmith, a massive hammer in his hand, his face grim. Behind him were two other townsmen, armed with shotguns. "That's enough, Croft," Gus boomed, his voice like thunder. "We heard the shot. We figured you were up to no good." Croft stared at them, then at Jedediah and Ilara, who stood together amidst the smoke and flames. His perfect plan had crumbled. The town was no longer his to command. His power, built on fear and intimidation, was dissolving in the face of this small, defiant family and the neighbors who had finally chosen a side. He looked at Jedediah, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled, before turning and disappearing into the blizzard, his remaining men scrambling after him. Gus and the others rushed in, helping to beat back the flames with blankets and snow. They worked together, a frantic, desperate team, and slowly they subdued the fire, leaving a gaping, charred hole in the wall and roof. The cabin was a wreck, filled with smoke and the smell of burnt wood, but it was still standing. Ilara sank to her knees, coughing, her body trembling with reaction. Jedediah knelt beside her, his hand on her back. He looked at Gus, his face etched with a gratitude that needed no words. "We saw his men riding out," Gus said, his voice rough. "Figured a blizzard was the kind of cover a coward like Croft would use. Looks like we were right." He looked around the damaged cabin. "He won't be a problem anymore. The sheriff will have to listen now. There are witnesses." The trial of Silas Croft was swift. Faced with the testimony of Gus and the others, and the confession of the man Jedediah had shot, his empire of lies collapsed. The full story of the rustling, the murder of the sheepherder, and the framing of Jedediah came to light. The town was rocked by the scandal, their shame as palpable as the winter cold. Jedediah was officially exonerated, his name cleared, his freedom given back to him not by the law, but by the courage of a widow and the solidarity of a few good men. Spring came, and with it, a sense of renewal. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new life on the plains. Jedediah and Gus, with the help of others from the town, rebuilt the damaged section of the cabin. The work was hard, but it was a healing labor. The sounds of hammers and saws replaced the echoes of gunfire and fear. The town, humbled and repentant, began to reach out. People would stop by with offerings, a pie, a sack of seeds, a length of fabric. They would speak to Ilara and to Jedediah, their voices quiet, their eyes filled with a newfound respect. They were no longer the town's outcasts. They were its conscience. One warm afternoon, when the new wall was finished and the roof was solid once more, Jedediah and Ilara stood outside, looking at their repaired home. The scars of the fire were still visible in the charred wood, but the structure was strong. Stronger even than before. He had been free for months now, free to go anywhere he wanted. The mountains called to him, the promise of a solitary life, a life free from the complications of other people. But he hadn't left. He couldn't. This small cabin, this small patch of land, had become his home in a way no place had ever been. Before, he turned to her. She was watching him, a quiet question in her eyes. The lie still stood between them, the foundation of their life together. It was time to give it a new name. "Ilara," he began, his voice soft. "The circuit judge will be here in a week. We could tell him the truth. Annul the whole thing. I could leave. You could have your life back." She looked at the cabin, her home, their home. She looked at the two wooden birds that now sat side by side on the new mantelpiece. She thought of the silence, the emptiness, that had filled this space before he came. He hadn't just filled the silence. He had filled the hollowness in her. "So, I have my life back, Jedediah," she said, her voice clear and steady. She stepped closer to him, her hand finding his. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers. "What we have," she said, her gaze meeting his, "is more real than any license, any law. It was born in fire and fear, but it's ours." He looked down at their joined hands, at the way her small hand fit so perfectly in his. He had come to this place in chains, a man with nothing left to lose. He had found everything, a home, a purpose, love. A quiet wedding was held a month later, not in the church but right there, beneath the vast open sky, with the plains stretching out around them. The whole town came not as judges but as witnesses. Gus stood as Jedediah's best man. Old Willow was there, her face a mask of serene wisdom. They stood before the circuit judge, the same man who had once condemned Jedediah to death, and spoke their vows. But the real vows had been spoken long before, in whispered conversations by the fire, in shared labor under the sun, in the desperate, united stand against the flames. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the land, Jedediah and Ilara stood by their cabin, watching their guests depart. A new quilt, a gift from the women of the town, lay on their bed. The pantry was full. The home was filled with the lingering warmth of laughter and fellowship. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. They had both been broken, shattered by life and loss into 1,000 pieces. But here, together, they had taken those broken pieces and built something new, something strong, something whole. He looked at her, at the peace that now settled in her eyes where the ghosts had once lived, and he knew he was finally home. The lie that had saved his life had become the truest thing he had ever known.